All right. So hi, everybody, and welcome to February's Ballotpedia Insights. For 2020, we're focusing our series on prominent figures who are engaging in the discussion around the divisions of our country. So as you guys have probably seen, at Ballotpedia, we're focusing heavily on the 206 pivot counties, which are the ones that voted Obama in 2008, Obama in 2012, and then Trump in 2016. They're spread all around the country. It really kind of resonates with a lot of the divisions in the country. So to help kick off this discussion for the year, we have with us author and Rolling Stone contributing editor, Matt Taibbi. Welcome, Matt.
How you doing? Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Today, we're going to be focusing in on some of the key points from his recent book, Hate Inc., Why Today's Media Makes Us Despise One Another. So if you're watching on the Zoom webinar or through Facebook Live and you have questions as we get started, please feel free to go ahead and drop them in, and we'll get to them as we can throughout the webinar. And then finally, before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that in the spirit of Ballotpedia Insights, we want to hear from political and legal scholars, researchers and reporters, and subject matter experts from a wide variety of backgrounds and opinions. So if anybody comes to mind for a series like this, please let me know. And just please keep that in mind that we're open to anybody who has a thought or opinion on this matter. So let's go ahead and get started. So these questions come from Ballotpedia staff, readers, anybody who submitted one. So Matt, you've seen a lot of different ebbs and flows in political trends during your time as a journalist. What was the final trend that kind of prompted you to really dig into this topic and write this book in particular?
It was really two things, but I think the main thing was covering the presidential election in 2016. It was remarkable. There were a couple of things that were remarkable. First was when I was covering the Trump campaign, just basically everywhere I went, the topic of the news media and how much people resented the news media was so dominant. And this had been growing over years. That was the fourth presidential election I'd covered for the magazine. And I had seen this trend developing over the course of the last decade or so. But in 2016, it was so overt. It was such a primary issue for so many people. I think a lot of people were motivated to vote for Trump because of their feelings towards the media. Additionally, the performance of the news media was remarkably bad during that election cycle. In particular, the constant mispredictions about the interpretation of poll results, the inevitability of a quote-unquote real candidate coming to replace Trump. Pundits were continually misjudging or misreading or ignoring what voters were trying to tell them. And I thought this was an important topic. In addition, you know, a lot of what I write about in Hate Inc. is just an accumulation of my own personal experience in the business and how I'm feeling the pressure to put out divisive content or content that targets one group or another. It was an accumulation of all those things, but I think 2016 was really the lodestar event in divisive media.
Yeah, that seems to be a very common theme. So let's dig into it. Why do you think hate is so attractive in the political space, in the journalism space? What's really driving?
Well, that's a great question. The first thing is just money. I think what people who aren't in the media, they may not understand sometimes. The media, the consumer media, it's a consumer product. We're selling you something. And one of the things I write about in the book is that the old commercial formula for media back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was to go for the widest possible audience. Back when there were only 3 networks and only a couple of newspaper chains, the whole idea of CBS, NBC, ABC was to try to get as many people as possible to watch. When the internet came along and the news landscape became more fragmented, innovators like Fox News, they came along and they realized that there was a faster route to make money, which was to not go for everybody, but to target a demographic and dominate that demographic. So what they would start to do is pre-select news stories that they knew would be attractive to a certain type of audience. They picked an older, more politically conservative audience. Roger Ailes famously described Fox's audience as 55 to dead. And they were picking news stories that they knew that that audience would like. Typically, it was things that would make them resentful towards liberals or Democrats or the Clintons or whatever it was. This was an enormously successful commercial formula. It vaulted Fox to the top of the ratings, and they stayed there for about 20 years. And I think by 2016, what all of the different news companies have realized is there's just no way to get everybody. So what you should do is just keep telling people what they want to hear. Your natural audience is going to come back. And the easiest way to do that is just to give them bad news about some other group. Because it's, well, for a couple of reasons. People enjoy the reflex of feeling superior to other people. It's the easiest way to kind of stimulate the prejudices of your audience. And also challenging your audience is the easiest way to lose your business. In other words, if you have a bunch of people who like Barack Obama, and I know people in the business who discover this, if you start telling them bad things about maybe things that the Obama administration has done or things that are disappointing, you're going to lose your audience. So all the news companies figured this out, and that's why if you turn on cable news now, it doesn't matter what network it is, you're pretty much going to get a monomaniacal narrative from around the clock. They are not going to deviate from a particular, timeline or narrative.
Yeah, it's so interesting that the news model has moved from kind of the Walter Cronkite where everybody had one place to tune into, and now that we have all these available options, it does make sense that the business model has moved to get the segment that you own and have them stick with you. It's a pretty big transformation.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's an important point. I mean, if you look at, when you bring up Walter Cronkite in 1972, the Gallup agency found that he was the most trusted man in America. He held that title for over a decade. Polls consistently found that he was the person the country trusted most. And the model is exactly what you were saying. The news companies design the news to be an experience the entire family could experience together. They would all sit around the television. Even if they had diverse views, they would sit there and take it in together, and maybe later they would argue about it. What happened in the 90s was they started to pick off those audiences. They started to have, here's the news for your right-wing uncle, and he's going to watch it in this room, and your teenager in the Shea t-shirt is going to watch this in another room, and it no longer became a shared experience. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that was an important point.
No, absolutely. And now that we're even thinking of different platforms too, the Snapchat news audience is way different than the MSNBC audience, and tailoring it to your age in addition to your political views. And it just feels like it's getting even more and more segmented as we're going through. Is that something you've noticed as well?
Absolutely, and it's because, among other things, because the technology is so incredible now. Like the data that they're getting about people's media habits, every time people click on anything or they watch anything or read anything, the internet platforms are getting data about how you behave, how you take in your news, where you take in your news, when you take in your news, how long you're engaging in things, and that itself is becoming a consumer product that they are selling to advertisers. So advertisers and news companies are now getting together and finding out what's the best way we can find these audiences and keep them engaged for a certain period of time. And they're designing the news product around that. And because they're getting so much information all the time, that's why you're getting this rapid fragmenting of all these different types of media, because they're constantly being able to target these things better. It's similar to, what the military is doing when they say that they can target, precision bombing. We're just getting more and more precise in the way that we attack audiences.
Right? It used to just be as simplistic as Nielsen ratings, and now it's, the news sites can know that I looked for a mid-century modern desk yesterday.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's pretty alarming. So we already touched on it a little bit, just kind of the evolution. How would you define maybe the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, just each of those decades? What do you think are the defining characteristics of those three decades?
Well, in terms of media, I think, again, we transformed in the 80s and 90s from this system that was really dominated by three networks and a couple of newspaper chains into a much wider, more fragmented audience. There were a couple of things that happened around that time period that really changed the press. First was the advent of the 24-hour news cycle. which had an enormous impact on how this business worked. So in the old days, when my father was a reporter, at most you were producing one piece of content per day. If you were a reporter, you were either writing a script for TV or writing an article that went into a newspaper. In the 24-hour news cycle, there started to be this awesome demand for content all the time. Reporters had to come up with stuff all the time. And so because of that, rather than sitting down and scripting something or writing something, they moved towards different kinds of content, like, for instance, just putting people on TV and having them argue with each other. There was that. There was the realization that breaking news stories that had a visual aspect, like, a baby falling down the well or a submarine that sunk into the bottom of the ocean, that was another great way to chew up airtime. So I think in the 90s, you started to see the beginning of this transformation to a new kind of urgent, minute-to-minute news model. In the 2000s, I think what happened that was really interesting is that people started to have widespread doubts about the press. They started to view it as a political institution that had its own institutional concerns and was not entirely trustworthy. There were a couple of events that I think were important there. The WMD episode, I think, was crucial for a lot of people. If you ask people how they feel about the news media, that gets brought up usually within the first couple of minutes. We went to war on, what turned out to be a series of specious premises, and people on both the left and the right feel that way. I think that's an important point when you talk about what happened in 2016 and now. That sense of betrayal, kind of spans the spectrum, and so I think there was a loosening of the press's grip on audiences in the 2000s, and then in this decade, what we've seen is a total revolt against this model. These media companies are rapidly losing their prior influences. I think you could make an argument that there are individual podcasters, people like Joe Rogan, who have more influence than, say, CBS Evening News. We were talking about Cronkite before. That just doesn't exist anymore. People they are putting their trust in these non-corporate news sources. And we're also seeing the impact of all this on presidential politics. In 2016, it was on the right side. Now it's on the Democratic side too. So I think that, it's been a three-stage process, and it's evolved over these last 3 decades.
Yeah, I mean, the Rogan endorsement of Bernie was probably one of the bigger bumps.
It was. Absolutely. Yep.
Now, when you talk about the 90s and kind of the development of the 24-hour news cycle, we hear a lot about some of the events that we wouldn't have heard much about them except for that cycle. So, the white Bronco in California and how that
totally
dominated the news cycle. Are there any political events that you think may not have been as big of a deal in the 90s, but because we had entered this new, really cyclical news cycle, it took hold of the country more?
Well, I think obviously the Clinton impeachment would have been a huge story anyway, but it snowballed because of the media construction. And, people forget that MSNBC was really born as a result of the Clinton story. They crafted special segments to tell, White House in crisis. I forget exactly what the segment was called, but the news networks realized that this story, what they're always looking for is to try to get people to have a sense of emergency about watching the news. Like, you have to keep watching it or else you're going to miss the most important thing. Right. Every day has to have the urgency of an election day. And with the impeachment story, what they found is they could market it to people as, you have to watch. The presidency hangs in the balance. They use phrases like, it's, the Clinton presidency is going to be measured in hours, not days, right? So they were constantly projecting to people that you can't turn it off because something might happen. And this, again, it had a huge impact on Fox's ratings because Fox more consciously than ever villainized the Clintons during this time period, but it would also had an impact on the quote unquote liberal media. They also hyped the story just as an event, not necessarily as a politicized event. So I think that was an important model on the sort of constant, sort of emergency style political reporting that's now basically nonstop. I mean, if you follow Twitter, there's always some kind of emergency that people are flipping out about. It's always a meltdown. And that's the emotional tenor of that, I think, really began there.
Yeah, it's so interesting, especially the rhetoric. The one that bothers me is that every election it's described as, this is going to be a historic election. Well, no duh, every election is history.
Right?
Just,
Yeah.
for me personally, even though Ballotpedia staff are immersed in this every day, it gets overwhelming to the point of, I don't know what to actually take super seriously versus not, because there's no good barometer of it these days. Everything feels like it has the heaviest weight of all time on your shoulders. And at some point, I can imagine people just give up.
Absolutely. And the hyperbolic approach to selling the news, I mean, you understand why they do it. They want to keep audiences coming back. So they have to say, this is the most important thing in history. This is the biggest moment, in the modern history of the United States. We heard that phrase over and over again during, not just 2016, that election, but also during Russiagate. And then, leading up to this election with the confrontation between Sanders and the Democratic Party. They're using these phrases over and over and over again, but they lose their meaning, as you say, over time. And what happens is audiences disengage and they don't trust anything that the press says anymore, which is, kind of a bummer for people like me, but we're seeing what's happening as the result of that with the voting results. People are tuning out this kind of reporting. Right,
absolutely. So how do you think, so I mentioned above that we talk a lot internally about pivot counties, which are the Obama-Trump counties. Do you think this thesis in your book affects people who are living in those counties, or how do you see kind of those citizens who are pivoting depending on kind of the populism of the day, or how does that interact with?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that was what you're talking about. Those counties, I think they were the crucial story of 2016. They're going to be the crucial story of, well, they're one of many crucial stories, but that's a very, very important storyline that was consistently misreported in 2016. I think one of the things I write about in the book is when I was covering that race in 2016, there was a moment in time when it was like sort of collectively decided by all the people who were covering the Trump campaign that the only acceptable explanation for what was happening was racism, right? Like when we were going to talk about Trump and these people were deplorable, they're voting this way because they want to go back to the 50s, they hate black people. And I think that clearly was a factor in what happened. There were clear racial themes in the race. Trump was clearly doing that consciously, but there were lots and lots of other things going on. I think these people, they were disaffected. They felt a loss of job security. They felt an enormous sense of betrayal by the news media. They felt targeted by the news media. I think a lot of people felt mischaracterized by the news media and voted the other way as a result of that. And a lot of it had to do with the sort of accumulated failures of the kind of neoliberal Washington consensus over the last couple of years. Some of it had to do with disaffection about our Mideast wars. Trump did very, very well in counties that had a lot of returning veterans, people who came home from the wars. That was not reported terribly well. And so I think in those counties, you see a mix of different emotions that is inspiring this behavior, but because there's an ideological emphasis on kind of not looking hard at all the different reasons why people voted this way, they're feeling increasingly disaffected, even more than they would be otherwise.
Do you think those types of voters and those types of citizens have a home right now with the media as it currently is? Kind of that movable middle?
They don't, and I hear this all the time. I mean, the cliche on the other side is these people watch Fox, but it's not always true. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of them were Fox viewers, but a lot of them felt an enormous sense of resentment toward Fox during the 2016 election cycle. Fox, if you remember correctly, was extremely hostile towards Trump at the beginning, and in conjunction with the way Fox was behaving, in a way with a lot of the former conservative heavyweights like George Will or even Glenn Beck, they were also contradicting a lot of what this new type of voter felt. Today, there's only a couple of different species of major news media. There's the Fox model, which is, roughly speaking, now Trump aligned, but it has some other. Chris Wallace takes a different tack, and then there's that, and then there's the kind of neoliberal centrist MSNBC/CNN model, which has slight differences, but really represents kind of mainstream Democratic Party politics. Everybody else, the entire galaxy of other opinions that people hold in America, and there's an enormous number of them, right? There's Greens, there's Libertarians, there's hardcore conservatives, there's hardcore progressives, leftists, socialists. They don't have a home in the media. They're not even they're not on the op-ed pages. They're not on panels. They're just not there. And so people are mad. They're very mad about that. They want a new place to get information.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. That makes sense. It mirrors what we hear from readers, which is, don't just cover the major parties, talk about the Libertarians, talk about the Greens, talk about Constitution. And it's been so dominated by Trump for nearly 5 years now that people are just looking for information,
right,
not opinions, not the commentary.
Yeah, I mean, just to take an example, when, for instance, the Soleimani attack took place, I often hear from people on email or by Twitter, I just want to find a place I can go for people to tell me what happened, like the core of facts. Like, I don't want any editorializing to go with it. I mean, that's not what I do for a living, but people want that. They want that kind of old school, neutral wire service kind of feel that doesn't have constant politicizing. And that's why I think they're going to sites like yours. They're going all these places that they where previously they would have gone to a news channel, and it's not in the newspaper anymore. They don't feel that way.
Yeah, it's so tricky to find just kind of dispassionate, no adjectives,
right,
these days.
Exactly.
So kind of along those lines, either in your intro or right off the bat in your book, you describe a self-loathing about how you could have contributed to this. Are you doing things any differently going forward? Or tell us a little bit about why you feel that way and what's changing.
Well, so I spent the early part of my career overseas. I was out of the United States from the ages of about 20 to 32. I came back from the former Soviet Union when I was 32 years old. And I had been in the media for a long time, but I remember when I came back, I went into a bookstore and there was a row of books for Republican readers and a row of books for Democrat readers. And you could tell what the difference was from 10 feet off, like the designs were different even. And I remember thinking, that's so weird. Like, why would any writer want to automatically write off half the audience? When you start as a writer, you're trained, you want everybody to read you want everybody to be interested in what you have to say. But in America, to market yourself in the press, you have to make a choice. Like, in order to have the weight of all the marketing power of the big corporate media apparatus behind you, you have to market yourself as one or the other. There's really not an in-between. And I came up through the quote unquote liberal media side. I worked for Rolling Stone, a traditionally liberal media institution. When I made media appearances, I did it on MSNBC or CNN or Democracy Now! Or places like that. I never went on Fox, or, I was rarely invited. But what happens over time is you start to shape the content for what you think that audience is. And you have to, for me, it was a conscious struggle always to try not to just throw red meat to that audience. There's a lot of pressure to do it. It's going to get traffic. Like I knew over the years, I did stories, for instance, about the Tea Party. I knew that if I added a whole bunch of negative adjectives and turned up the rhetoric, that my audience was going to like that, and I really struggled with that over the years. I tried consciously to go in the other direction, to criticize Democrats when I felt it was warranted. I covered the financial crisis in 2008, which was a story that had blame on both sides, and I really tried to make that clear as much as possible. But it's something you have to struggle against, and for most reporters, it's a financial choice, because the more you feed the beast, so to speak, the more feedback you're going to get, more invites you're going to get, the more speaking invitations you're going to get, the public speaking income is going to come. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult. I think people don't talk about it enough, but it's a thing.
Yeah, and I mean, even just saying that, speaking those words, I'm sure is difficult to kind of bring truth to that's the current status quo that we're in, and here's what it is. But yeah, it's really fascinating to hear your background on that and just how it's evolved. You mentioned your time abroad. One of my coworkers wanted to know, you did spend time in Uzbekistan. How did that experience, how did your time overseas shape your approaches to American journalism?
Well, so I spent most of my career in Russia. I spent a little bit of time in Uzbekistan when I was very young. I was 21, and but being in those autocratic environments where the relationship between the news media and gangland interests is basically undisguised. And typically what you would have, both in Russia, I mean, to a lesser extent in Uzbekistan. I also lived in Mongolia where this was true to a lesser extent. But, you know, a major newspaper or television station would be owned by some kind of oligarch, and whatever they wanted the news of the day to be, there would be a dependable group of people at the front of the news operation who would write whatever opinions they were supposed to write, or they would find the news stories that would agree with that person's point of view, whatever they wanted to support. And, you know, the Russian reporters had a term for what they called it. They called it selling jeans, when they were just having an opinion that someone else wanted them to have, that were paid to have. That was called selling jeans by Russians. That's how they literally made their money, by hawking their point of view to some rich mobster. And I think when you see that, it has a real impact on how you understand how the media works. So ultimately, you know, financial interests and the influence of who owns media companies, it does eventually trickle down to whoever's working in those companies. And in America, it's not as open and direct as it is in another country, but it's still there. And I think it helped me to see that in a way that maybe it wouldn't for people who don't have that experience. But a lot of foreign correspondents talk about that. I mean, their understanding of the media is very different from people who grew up here.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That's quite an experience to have as your background. So we already mentioned Joe Rogan, so let's keep on the wrestling metaphors. So throughout the book, you use the metaphor of professional wrestling. Can you outline what you mean by that, and how you think it does carry over to journalism and that philosophy?
Yeah, it's funny. And during the 2016 race, I remember when Trump started to rise, a lot of the reporters were rushing out to buy these books like The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, all these books about fascism. And I ran out to buy books about professional wrestling and started to watch the WWE because it was pretty clear to me at the very beginning that, well, first of all, Trump has WWE experience. He was, and anybody in wrestling will tell you this, he was classically kind of playing a character that's very prominent in wrestling theology, which is the heel. This is an important point. Wrestling is a very, very bankable, profitable business, and it's very subtle and actually quite sophisticated what they do. And what they're basically doing is they're selling this very simplified story of good versus evil, and they have heroes and villains, and they relentlessly hype these conflicts between these two types of characters. And the best shows, the most profitable shows, involve the best villains. So they have to make evil characters, and those characters have to go into the ring and storm around the ring and yell at the crowd and say, "You people all suck, and I'm going to win, and I'm going to crush your hero." Then the hero comes in dressed in white and bashes the villain, and everybody feels good, and it's sort of the ritualistic celebration of good versus evil. And that's what Trump was doing. Trump was playing that heel character. He was perfect for drumming up audiences in exactly the same way that they do before they hype wrestling matches. And this is why the commercial formula works. It continues to work. The news companies are making record profits. Trump is a perfect heel. He sells for both sides. There are people who love him, people who hate him, but they all want to come to the audience and watch him fight. They all want to watch the fight. And this is what the news has been reduced to. It's been reduced to an ongoing, ritual celebration of Trump versus the other side. And there's really no other narrative that we see on TV. You're either picking one side or the other, and it's intellectually just, there's nothing there. It's an empty experience.
Yeah, and it started the second he made his presidential announcement. It's just been 24 Trump. So.
I mean, yeah, that was a classic WWE thing, with the coming down the elevator and everything. I mean, his whole presentation is classic wrestling heel with stomping around the stage. When you watch him at his events, he'll say something ridiculous and put his hands behind his back and go like this. I mean, it's straight out of heel acting. It's amazing. And I've talked to a bunch of wrestlers about this too. They all think he's a master at it, but that's not necessarily a good thing.
It's fascinating. So you said that the book Manufacturing Consent is an inspiration for Hate Inc. Can you walk us through the premise for that book and how it relates to what you're talking about?
Yeah, so Noam Chomsky, the MIT professor, the one-time MIT professor, and Ed Herman, who was an economics professor, they got together in the 70s and 80s. They presented this model of how the media works in America. And the core premise was, even though people in America may have this idea that there's no censorship in the American media, and what you're actually seeing when you turn on the television or watching TV news is an artificially narrowed debate, where the views of the political consensus are disproportionately represented. People who have a dissenting point of view, or want to promote another point of view in the news, they're simply drowned out of the business. They do not get promoted. Their points of view end up being excluded or buried deep inside the newspapers. And so, for instance, on a story like Vietnam, the debate you might see on TV is, can we win in Vietnam? Yes, we can win, or no, maybe we can't win. But this whole other galaxy of things about the war, like, for instance, maybe we're committing atrocities over there, we shouldn't have gone in the first place, where a million civilians are being killed, that all is out. So we're seeing a phony debate where the parameters are from here to here, and everybody operates within that one area. And that's the premise of manufacturing consent, is the artificially narrowed debate. And that still goes on in the press. I mean, I talked to Chomsky for this book, and it's absolutely the same instinct goes on in the news media. If you're the kind of person who is likely to explore other areas, you just simply do not get promoted in this business. You don't get on television, you don't get on the front page, and all that continues to happen. And it's why things like WMD happen, and why stuff like 2016 happened.
Interesting. Do you think that this trend is the same across all forms of media and platforms? Like, is it different between newspapers versus magazines versus online versus television, or is it more prominent among some of those platforms versus others?
The major difference has to do with how the media is funded. So if you have a listener or reader supported medium, it is going to have a sharply different point of view, and it's going to have a lot more independence than one that is advertiser funded or has some other kind of model. So for instance, you mentioned the Joe Rogan show or Jimmy Dore, or an independent podcast. They're going to have a lot more license to explore different points of view, whereas a big corporate television organization like NBC, MSNBC, CNN, whatever it is, they are going to have a diametrically opposed model, where their whole idea is to try to attract the demographics so that they can sell to advertisers, right? And so, yeah, I think that's where you're going to see the differences. The newspapers and magazines where I work, their revenue model has been completely disrupted. That kind of advertising, the big, cars, liquor, cigarettes, those big full page ads that used to support our business, they're gone. So we have to find new ways of making money. But the distinction here is similar to the distinction in politics, where is it readers and the public that's supporting the media model, or is it some corporate sponsor? And it's similar to politics. Somebody like Bernie Sanders, their support comes from individual small donors, millions of people, or is it a few big donors that are driving somebody else's campaign? And that's kind of the same division that goes on in press.
Well, it's so interesting to think about media business models now, because we're seeing a lot of small papers moving to a nonprofit model. But even those, they're receiving big foundation grants, and who are the big foundations, and it's really hard to kind of, quote, follow the money. But it's important to see, because even the not-for-profits now have these foundation grants that could influence.
Of course, yeah, PBS too.
Mm-hmm,
I mean, yeah. I mean, it's very difficult to discern. And again, these pressures are not always visible, right? Mm-hmm. So people, if they're owned by, they have an individual private owner who might say that he or she is totally dedicated to media independence. Still, when reporters sit down to do their jobs, they're thinking about how is this going to be received upstairs? And sometimes that's more overt than others. Sometimes they're actually asking you to go out and find whatever you find and let the chips fall where they may. But other times it's implied that they want something else, and I talk to a lot of people in the business, and we all feel it to one degree or another.
Very interesting. Do you think there are there disruptors right now trying to break this trend, and who are they?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people. I think there are a lot of independent news outlets. There are a lot of different models that are disruptive, whether it's the independent podcasting model, it's people who have Patreon accounts, or, I write for a thing called Substack, which is a similar thing. It's a reader supported, service. There are also outlets like The Intercept, right, where the idea, even though, it's a tech billionaire who owns the company, the idea was to disrupt the traditional way that the media advertiser generated model. There isn't this with television yet. I think that's one of the things that hasn't happened, where you have a sort of listener or reader or viewer supported television news network that's dedicated to doing just straight news and independent journalism. I don't think we have that yet, but there is some of that with online and print publications. Also, I think things like podcasts like Serial. They maybe it's not classic. It is investigative journalism, but it tapped into a new way to pay for it, which is really interesting, or a new way to grab audiences. So I'm actually quite hopeful about the future of getting audiences and monetizing it and being able to pay for good journalism.
Yeah, because we're all using MailChimp right now, right?
Right. Exactly.
Serial. Yeah. That's really fascinating. What are your favorite political podcasts to listen to on a daily basis?
I don't really, even though I do a podcast, I don't really listen to them too much. I follow them, The Rising, that had, the Hill show with Crystal Ball and Sagar Enjeti. I do listen to Rogan. I listen to Jimmy Dore. There are a few others. I'm more of a reader than I am a listener, but I think there's a lot of stuff out there. I think, what I think is great about the new landscape is that it's very individualized. If you want to find a podcast that's just about, I don't know, for instance, the Jeffrey Epstein scandal, somebody's doing it, Yeah, there's two, right? Right. Yeah. And that's great, and to some degree, it's kind of disillusioning for people like me, because, the notion of journalism is this priesthood of people, of the small number of people who are qualified to do this. No, anybody can do this. They just have to, you can get good at it quite quickly. And all you have to do is be really interested in it and dig and do research. And I think it's great. The stuff that's going on right now on the internet is fascinating.
That brings up an interesting fragmentation point too. It's not just about political views or age or anything else we've already discussed. It's also about, you want to know all about Bill Cosby? Here's a podcast just about Bill Cosby. Or,
exactly.
Here's this murder that happened in LA. Let's give you 8 episodes on how it was investigated. And that's a really interesting trend too. And I wonder how that's going to shape, because I know there's always been documentaries and series on different events, but we're getting really
granular.
Yeah, let's talk about Elizabeth Holmes for 20 hours. But I don't know how that could potentially change media as a whole either. Have you thought about that? It's just kind of
the old days. I think what was, there were good things and bad things about the old model, but in the old days, the CBS, NBC, ABC, they told you what the news was. They told you what it looked like, what it sounded like, how long it lasted, what the tone of the segments would be, what the voice of the segments would be. And people kind of grew up with this idea of what the news was. Now, there's a 1,000 different varieties of it. People decide for themselves what kind of news they want to listen to, what they want the format to be. And, they're all competing against each other, and, or they're not, they're helping each other too. I think that's, a principle that I grew up with in the news was that reporters weren't supposed to care who was first all that much. We were all kind of supposed to be contributing to a story. Like if I worked on a story about what happened in the financial crisis, I liked it when somebody in New York Magazine or Bloomberg or whatever added to that story. And I think there's a lot more of that going on now. Like I think the different outlets are supplementing and complementing one another much better than they ever were before. And I think that's cool.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. What is the average citizen to do about the situation? How should we be consuming news? What should we be looking for when we're determining where to get our sources?
I think people are already doing it. I mean, I think the first big lesson that I had in the book, and the biggest message that I wanted people to understand from Hate Inc. is just to have consumer awareness about watching the news. I mean, Americans have a lot of consumer awareness, a heightened sense of consumer awareness about almost everything else nowadays. You know, how much saturated fat are you putting in your body when you bite into a cheeseburger? How bad for you is a cigarette when you light one up? What kind of safety record does the kind of car you buy have? You know, are there elements, radioactive elements in the things or toxic elements in the toys that you put in your backyard that your kids are going to play on? People think about those things. They don't think about what they put in their brains, which is also a consumer product, in the end, that makes us nervous. It makes us unhappy, makes us dislike one another. And it's not natural. I think that's you asked me in the beginning, what some of the reasons were I decided to do this book. One of them was that I was so struck by the difference in how people behave in real life versus how they're portrayed in the press. You get a bunch of Americans together in a room who have disparate views. They actually tend to be pretty civilized with each other. They will work it out. They're nice to each other. They're respectful of each other's points of view. They may even say things like, I don't agree with what you have to say, but I respect it. You get that a lot when you go out on campaign events. People are very open, but the image you get of watching television is a country that's completely at war with one another, where people hate each other to the point of wanting to, take up arms against one another. And I think if people have more awareness about how manipulative that format is, they will, relax around each other a little bit more and feel a little bit more kindly disposed to one another. And that's another thing that I hope.
Yeah, and when you had those local newspapers, when you had the community reporters, you would see them every day, or you'd see them at the events. And now that we've moved to a much more national media, you don't see your reporters every day, so they can kind of drum up the anger without being seen at a local grocery store. It's just, that's just a fascinating thing. Now you mentioned we are getting better at kind of identifying good sources and bad sources. And I know a lot of the tech platforms are getting involved in this, trying to identify fake news or, suspicious, could be false information. Do you think there's a problem of who guards the guardians there though? That some segment of the country on both sides will remain suspicious if Facebook calls something suspicious, or, on Google search, there's always controversy about what they're putting in the news feed versus not. How is there a possibility for a credible third party to come in and say, yes, this is a credible source? Or are we too segmented at this point to then believe the Guardian, whoever's the arbiter of what's true news?
I am very suspicious of the entire premise of that we need somebody to oversee what is and is not fake news. Right. We have lived in this country for a long time without having any kind of media regulator. We had an extremely effective system for rooting out true news and fake news. For things like libel and slander, we had a highly effective and pretty subtle way of dealing with that was based on litigation. The person who was directly harmed by a false broadcast or a false news report got to go to court, argue his or her case. They would be remunerated for the damage, and that would provided a very, very serious disincentive to people like me to write false things. Also, there was a huge reputational risk involved. If you were in a commercial enterprise, you wrote something that was untrue, especially if you knowingly did it, that was the end of your career. I mean, that's the bargain that's understood in this business. And that's been enough for hundreds of years in this country to keep people from sorting out fake news and not fake news. Mm-hmm. This notion that we need a kind of overseer to tell us what is real and what is not real, when we had a very a system where people basically trusted people because they had built up a record or they didn't over a period of years. You talked about Walter Cronkite. Even though those news organs did do a lot of fake news over the years, the whole issue of how you build up trust as a reporter was central to the job. And that's how it worked, right? You were either good or you weren't. You were trustworthy or you weren't. People got that sense about you from reading your work over the years. I don't think we need Facebook or Google to be constantly judging what is true and what isn't. I am very, very worried about the algorithms that, Google now stresses a thing they call authority, right? So the example they gave me was if you put in baseball as a search term, in the old days, you might have gotten the local little league. Now you get MLB.com because they tell you that Major League Baseball is more authoritative than your local little league. I don't think that's true. I think news audiences are good at sorting out what isn't true and what isn't on their own, and that we should leave it to them. And giving somebody else the power to decide what isn't true adds an enormous temptation for political mischief that wasn't there before.
That's a great take. This all reminds me too that I think there is a very good possibility that we kind of return to a different type of media setting, because what you were just saying reminds me of way back in the 1800s, the early 1900s, when voters were seeing the union produced paper, the corporate produced paper, and they were all giving their opinions, and people could easily sort out, oh yeah, this editorial in this union produced paper, this is from directly the union boss. And it feels like we've been here before.
Absolutely.
And went back, and it just feels, is this just kind of the natural order of things?
Yeah, and what you're pointing out is really important, because the model that we had for 60 or 70 years, where it was this neutral, flat, third-person recitation of the news that was supposedly objective, people have this idea that that's the natural order of things. It's not. That was just a commercial strategy that these networks employed. One of the first big news readers was a guy named Lowell Thomas. He was a radio reader for CBS, and he discovered early on that just reading the news made people upset. He wanted to stimulate that reflex and get people worked up and explore all those different emotions with his newscast. But his advertisers told him they didn't want him to do it. The sponsors said they wanted him to play it down the middle, be neutral in tone. He was a great performer and great reader. He could have done it either way, but he did that neutral tone that became the format for most modern news. And exactly what you're talking about is true. In the old days, the news was an amalgam of very, very sharp points of view, and people were able to sort it out for themselves. And I think they can again in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. So what trends are you going to be looking for this cycle? What are you particularly interested to see shake out in 2020?
Yeah, I just think, going forward, this problem of where do people go to get their information is going to become more and more acute, because especially when you saw what happened last week in Nevada, and there was an enormous backlash from Sanders voters to the Washington Post story, about him having Russian influence, or that Russians want him to win, which was repeated everywhere across the news media. There's an enormous amount of anger about that. So these networks are, on the Trump side, the news media already 4 years ago was completely villainized. Now they're losing, a half or 2/5 of the audience on the other side. Where are all these people going to go to get their news? They're going to have to find some new place. And I would imagine that that's going to start being developed more this year, because it's a long season and people have a need to follow this story. And I don't think they really have a place to do it right now.
Yeah, we'll see where they end up going.
Yeah.
What develops, what percolates. And I think 2020 will be a really interesting experimental breeding ground for just the different types of business models and everything that's happening.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. So thank you so
Great.
much for joining us today, Matt. Where can people find you online?
You can find me at www.rollingstone.com. I have a podcast that's called Useful Idiots. You can find on that I do with Katie Halper, and that's on YouTube anywhere. And I'm also at a website called Substack at taibbi.substack.com.
Great. Well, this was February's Ballotpedia Insights. If you have any suggestions for participants going forward or feedback for us, let us know at editor@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. Thank you guys for joining, and happy election cycle.
Thank you so much.